Hey Stitchers, today's video is a little bit different, a bit out of my comfort zone. I am going to be doing my first and possibly my last stitch tutorial video, depending on how this one goes. The only reason I'm doing this video is because quite a few of you have asked me to do a specialty stitch tutorial. In no way, shape or form do I consider myself to be an expert on these stitches. All I am is a self-taught common and garden needle worker with a passion for counted thread work and counted thread techniques. So I wouldn't want anybody to think I'm doing this video because I think, I'm the best out there. I am so not the best at anything out there. But having said that, the fact that I'm just an ordinary self-taught stitcher hopefully will encourage all of you out there who are perhaps hesitant or worried about doing specialty stitches, because seriously, if I can do it, then so can all of you if you want to. Obviously not everybody wants to do specialty stitches, and that's absolutely fine, but I know some of you out there really want to have a go but are just a bit nervous about it. So hopefully this video will help you to see that it's well within any stitcher's grasp to do specialty stitches. I know I've said it before, but I really despise the term specialty stitches because it makes it sound as though only master embroiderers can do these stitches. I mean, there's thousands of different counted thread techniques out there and stitches out there. I'm not saying I can't do all of them, and I'm not saying that some of them aren't more difficult than others. There are some really complicated ones out there, but the sort of stitches that I use a lot are very simple. They just look fancy. So once you learn how to do them, you'll probably think, oh my goodness, is that all there is to it? Seriously, you will think that. So just because they're called specialty stitches, they are well within everybody's grasp to do. There's nothing special about doing them. You don't need to be specially skilled in order to do them. I don't think. That's just my opinion. So what I tend to think to myself when I come across a new stitch to me is I just think, there are only so many holes that thread can go into. You can't go too badly wrong. And normally, just by your own eye, straight away, when you do a new specialty stitch, you can tell if it's looking right or not to you. Then all you need to do then, if perhaps it's not right, frog it. It's no big deal. Just rip out the stitch and have another go. It's not a big deal to do that. So I just wanted to say that in case any of you watch this and you really want to have a go, have a go. What's the worst that can possibly happen? One thing I would just like to get out of the way before I embark on this stitch tutorial, it might turn into a slight bit of a rant, but one thing that is guaranteed to irritate me when I read it on cross-stitch forums, cross-stitch groups and the like, is any sentence relating to stitching which starts with the phrase, "you must." Really bugs me. There's only one phrase in stitching that starts with the words "you must," and that is, you must ensure that all the top stitches of your cross goes in the same direction. That's the only rule that there is in stitching. There are other principles which, should you choose to follow them, will make your life a lot easier, but that's kind of the only rule. So it really irritates me when I see people say things like, you must grid your work, you must park, you must start in the centre, you must start in the top left hand corner, you must wash your work, you must use this type of thread, you must use that type of thread. No. My instant reaction to that is, no, I must not, but that's just the type of person I am. So I just wanted to say that because the way I stitch my specialty stitches is just one way of doing it. There are several other ways. For example, the stitch I'm going to be demonstrating today, the Rhodes stitch, I stitch my stitches in a counter-clockwise, an anti-clockwise direction. Other people stitch theirs in a clockwise direction. It really doesn't matter. It's the same stitch, just slightly executed in a different way. In the same way that some of us cross our crosses with a top stitch going bottom left or top right, others of us cross our crosses going from bottom right to top left. It doesn't matter as long as you're consistent, and it's the same with specialty stitches. You just have to, your starting point for each stitch must be the same for every stitch so that it looks consistent. And the second thing that bugs me when I read it is phrases like Aida is for beginners, real stitchers stitch on even weave and linen. That is just so wrong, it's untrue. Now with speciality stitches, I will say your life is a lot easier if you can use an even weave of some sorts. For the purposes of this demonstration, I'll be using 28 count even weave. That's the fabric of my personal choice. Now if you're an Aida stitcher, please don't switch off. Speciality stitches can be stitched on Aida. In fact, I have, for the purposes of this demonstration, I've stitched some on Aida. So I don't want anybody to think that just because you might prefer Aida, that speciality stitches aren't for you. They can be if you want them to be. They're just slightly more difficult. Well, not difficult, but obviously you understand if you're an Aida stitcher, you've got to pierce the fabric, pierce the weave of the fabric, and sometimes that can be, you know, a bit annoying. It does make counting much more difficult, but it can definitely be done. So I don't want anybody to think that just because I'm stitching it on even weave that it can't be done on any other fabric. It can be. I would like to think that anybody that's watched my videos on YouTube, if you've managed to sit through them all, if anything stands out to you, I would like to think it's the fact that I believe in very strongly in the rights of stitchers, by which I mean the stitcher's right to choose a pattern that they love, the stitcher's right to choose the fabric that they want to stitch it on, whether that be Aida, whether it be even weave, whether it be linen, and the right to choose the thread they want to use, whether that may just be DMC, standard DMC cotton, whether it be hand-dye cotton, whether it be a pearl thread, or even if it's the finest silk thread in the land. It's a personal choice, there is no right or wrong, and no stitcher should be looked down upon in any way for using DMC cotton on 14 count Aida, and nor should any other stitcher feel that they can't share their love of the finest hand-dyed silks and hand-dyed fabrics in the land. There's room for everybody. So I just kind of wanted to say that, because I wouldn't want anybody to think that I'm in favour of one or the other. What I'm in favour of is that everybody stitch what they love, stitch what you love. Doesn't matter what anybody else is doing or what fabric they're using, what threads they're using. Stitch what you love. Anyway, so I've got that little rant out of the way. I do have my moments. So, the purpose of this video is to show you, hopefully, how to stitch a Rhodes stitch. Now, I've chosen that stitch for a few reasons. Firstly, it is easy. I know easy is a relative term when something's new to you. But hopefully, if I demonstrate it well enough, you'll see that it's actually quite simple, but it looks very decorative. And it can be used in lots of different ways. So don't think that just because that speciality stitches can only be used for speciality stitch patterns, so only chatelaines, you know, you can only stitch a speciality stitch if it's in a pattern. Hopefully you know me well enough by now to know that I don't necessarily believe in that. I believe that you can put whatever you want in any piece that you're stitching. So Rhodes stitches do actually lend themselves quite nicely to just being added in to any cross stitch work, any sort of piece of counted thread work really. Whether it be in a border or as part of the pattern itself, they are quite versatile. And once you've got the basics down, so you understand the concept of the stitch, there are lots and lots of variations of that stitch. You could just go on. You could do a whole piece completely made up of different shapes and sizes of Rhodes stitches. There are that many different variations. So what I'm going to do now is demonstrate 2 basic Rhodes stitches, and then I'm going to show you the other variations, because I don't want to crowd this up with me, me stitching loads. But just to get I'll demonstrate the basics. So I'll demonstrate how to stitch a dense Rhodes stitch and how to stitch, I was going to say a plain Rhodes stitch, but another version of a Rhodes stitch. And then I'll show you some variations that you can do. So I'm hoping that this video is useful, that any of you out there that are feeling nervous about doing this, hopefully you won't be after you've watched this. So grab some fabric, whatever fabric you have to hand, and we'll see if we can stitch some Rhodes stitches together. Right, stitchers, I really hope this is going to work. Basically what I've done is I've clamped my iPad, which I use to record my videos, onto my Lowry stand. so that as I stitch you can hopefully see what I'm doing. The trouble with that is, of course, is that in order to stitch I'm actually looking through my iPad to see what I'm doing, and obviously it's reversed, so this might be a bit strange. I promise you I can do these stitches. I've stitched hundreds, possibly thousands of them, but it's just a bit weird, this kind of setup that I've got. But anyway, enough waffling, I hope you'll bear with me. These are the stitches I'm going to show you how to stitch. So this one here is what I call, and what people refer to as, a dense Rhodes stitch. You can see when you look at the stitch around the edges, every single hole has been, sorry, the iPad is going in and out. Every single hole has been filled in, each to the next. When you look at the other one here, this stitch, this is also a Rhodes stitch, but you'll notice that every other hole has a leg of a stitch in. So they're basically the two varieties you can get. You get a Rhodes stitch which has been all filled in, and one which has every other hole filled in. So those are the two that I'm hopefully going to try and demonstrate for you today, if you bear with me. Now, first of all, I forgot to mention, rather than worry about copyrights and things like that with stitch diagrams, I have made my own very, very rudimentary stitch diagrams. And so one of the things with speciality stitches you can appreciate is most of them, all of them, if you have a pattern with them in, they will come with a speciality stitch diagram. Now if you've never seen one of those, they can be a bit frightening for the first time, so I'll just talk you through the one that I've done. So on the screen now I'm going to put up a stitch diagram that I've done, very, very basic, for this stitch here, this dense Rhodes stitch. Now as you look at that diagram, some of you will probably look at it straight away and think, oh yeah, I totally get that, I can see where this is going. Others of you will see all those numbers, all those lines, and have a miniature freak out. Don't panic. It's quite simple. There's just a few things to bear in mind when you look at just about any stitch diagram for any stitch. And those things are, when you look at that diagram, the grid lines that you see represent threads of the fabric. And what make up the squares aren't stitches, but they represent the holes in the fabric. So hopefully that helps you to decipher that stitch diagram a little bit, and that's basically the same for any stitch diagram you'll find. The other thing to bear in mind with stitch diagrams, it's always worth noting whether it's a diagram stitched over one or over two, how many threads of fabric are represented by each of those grid lines, because sometimes if it's just a basic sort of cross stitch diagram, you'll often find it will say that one line on the chart represents 2 threads of a fabric, so if you're stitching over 2 crosses, for example. But on most speciality stitch diagrams, each line on the fabric is represented by 1 line on the grid. But it's always worth checking your stitch diagram just to make sure that is the case. The other thing, the third thing you just need to know, is those numbers. When you see an odd number, it means you come up through the fabric, and when you see an even number, it means you go down through the fabric, and obviously that will be explained a bit more as we go along. So quite often when you're learning a new speciality stitch and you've got the stitch diagram in front of you, either out loud or in your head, it's useful just to count those numbers. So if you do get a bit lost when you're in the middle of a stitch, then you think, oh right, I was on number 10 or whatever, and then you can look at number 10 on your diagram and then you know where you are, at what point in the stitch you were at that time. I still do that sometimes now for quite complicated stitches because you can quite easily get lost, but hopefully that won't be the case in this demonstration, but who knows. Okay, so back to the fabric. Now this is going to be interesting if I can get to the right place. You'll see what I've done in preparation for this is I've actually stitched some crosses on the fabric just to give a bit of perspective and a sense of where we're going with this. So you can see there's little groups of 9 crosses, and those groups of crosses here are actually the same amount of space that each of the Rhodes stitches we're going to do takes up on the fabric. So it's the same area covered. So each of those little gaps I'm hopefully going to manage to stitch a Rhodes stitch on if I can stop the iPad from, it keeps focusing. But anyway, hopefully you'll see what I'm doing. Right, so my thread is already at position 1 on the chart, so I've gone up through the fabric at number 1. Now, as I mentioned, I stitch my Rhodes stitches and most of my stitches starting in the bottom left hand corner, and I work my way around. Whatever way you choose, you might decide it's more comfortable for you to go in the opposite direction. Just go with what you feel is best, but I'm just going to demonstrate the way I do it. So we've come up at 1 and now we go down at 2. And this forms the first leg of our Rhodes stitch. Now it's quite important and very useful just to double check, especially when you're stitching a new stitch, that you've got the first leg of that stitch in the correct place, because obviously you're going to use that stitch to guide you through the rest to complete the stitch. So say for example if I'd accidentally gone over an extra thread and started there, it would have been incorrect and would have been completely out of alignment. So it's always worth noting, because that stitch there is going to guide us, so we know that we're going to be following this line of stitches, this line of holes in order to complete the stitch. And it's also worth watching your tension when you do speciality stitches as well. Now I'm stitching this with a single strand of floss, single strand of thread, because we're doing a dense Rhodes stitch, but obviously you can vary your strands as I'll go to show when we do the next stitch. So now I'm coming up at 3 and going down at 4. It's very weird trying to do this whilst watching it on the iPad. And then coming up at 5 and going down at 6. So you're just following along to the next vacant hole really. Coming up at 7, going down at 8, and you can see that twist is starting to form in the centre. Coming up at 9, going down at 10, coming up at 11, going down at 12. Am I even counting this right? I don't know. It's hard to do 2 things at once. There we go. Coming up at 13, going down at 14. And then obviously it's a lot easier this way. That's why I put these blocks, so you could see where the stitch is sort of contained. But this is when you turn and you start going up instead of going across. So I've completely forgotten at what point in the stitch we're at, but you get where this is going. So you basically keep working your way around till you get to the end. Much easier to do when you don't have an iPad between you and your stitching, trust me. And this is the last leg of the stitch. And there you go, that's Rhodes stitch. You can't see the individual stitches very well, but you've watched me hopefully as I've gone round and done them. Here's the second one. Again, make sure that first stitch is in the right place and just work your way around. So on the perimeter of this little square there shouldn't be any holes that are empty for this particular version of the Rhodes stitch. We're filling every hole with a leg of the stitch. Work your way around. Once you've got the basic grasp of just doing lots of stitches, straight stitches, there's so many different variations you can do of this particular stitch. It doesn't just have to be all squares and rectangles. This is the bit that's really difficult for me to see. Hoping this is coming out alright on the iPad. I know it's probably going in and out, but hopefully you've got the idea of what I'm trying to do. I'm concentrating, so I'm not talking. It's hard to do two things at once. Right, and here's the last leg of the stitch going in. So there you go, that's how to stitch a dense Rhodes stitch. And although it doesn't show up very well because I'm using purple thread obviously, but you'll notice it on some other ones that I've stitched just to show you, is that that very last stitch that goes on the diagonal lays in the same way on each of these Rhodes stitches, and that's what I meant when you can start your speciality stitch anywhere as long as you're consistent. You want the very last leg of each of those stitches to be positioned in the same direction, so they are in this case there on the diagonal. So that is that stitch. So I'm not going to do another one, this video would be hours long, but hopefully you've got the general idea, and obviously any questions you need to know the answers to, then just ask. Now I'm going to attempt to demonstrate how to stitch this Rhodes stitch here. It's exactly the same principle as this one, except we're just going into every other hole for this one. This stitch I'm using 2 strands of thread. You'll see in some stitch diagrams, in fact the chatelaine that I'm stitching at the moment, for the Rhodes stitches, some of the Rhodes stitches in that particular pattern, you use 3 strands of thread, which can be a bit of a nightmare getting them to lay nice and straight, which is why people often suggest a laying tool if you're going to be stitching a lot of speciality stitches. Now I don't have a trolley needle, but I know a stitcher that does use one, so I will link to her video below if you don't know what a trolley needle is, or any sort of other form of laying tool. What I do use sometimes is what the needles I use for hardanger. So sometimes I'll use, I think this is a size 22 needle, just to help me to lay the threads nice and straight, because obviously when you're using 2 strands, there's a possibility for those threads to twist, and you want them to lay as nice and flat, parallel, side by side to each other as possible. Now this is going to be a bit difficult for me to demonstrate because I've got one hand holding the hoop and the other's obviously holding the needle. Ordinarily I have, as you know, my work in a scroll frame and a stand, so I've got 2 hands to use just in case I do need to flatten a thread. But anyway, we shall see how we get on. So here we go, same principle again, up at 1, down at 2. So what I normally do is I railroad all my stitches anyway, all my crosses, so I generally do the same for my speciality stitches where I'm using 2 threads, which means basically that I put my needle through the middle of the thread, the 2 strands of thread, and then go down. So it makes the threads lie nice and flat. So that's 1 to 2. And now we're going to go over 1 thread and come up at 3 here. So we've actually got a hole there that's not been occupied, and we're going to do the same again and go down at 4, come up at 5. That's better, I can see now. That's what happens when you've got a cream colour carpet. I can't see the holes. So it's the same principle as the last stitch. We're just missing a thread each time. But we're still making those straight lines in order to make that twist in the centre of the stitch. It was really a bad idea to use purple thread. It's too dark. But anyway, we get the idea. And then this is the last stitch in this particular variation of a Braid stitch. So there you go, and that's that one stitch. That one's actually a bit easier to see because it's obviously nowhere near as dense. You can see the white, the fabric showing through, so you can see the different legs of the stitch. Now hopefully I've got enough thread left just to do one more of these Rhodes stitches for you. So that's the first stitch set. One thing you probably will notice if you've not done speciality stitches before, and if it's something you start doing, is that you do use an awful lot of thread, especially for stitches like these, because obviously you're using the same length of thread on the front for the stitch as you are on the back of your stitch. Now it can be quite tempting at times to take a little shortcut. I know on occasions, especially when I've been using, for example, an expensive silk thread, I am tempted to take shortcuts to be a bit more frugal with my thread, but in the long run it's not worth it, because your stitches will not lie flat on the front of your fabric. So for example here, sometimes, quite often, I'm tempted, instead of beginning my stitch here and going along, I'm tempted to finish my stitch here and go down there, just because then I'm in the right position without wasting too much thread on the back to start the next stitch here. Now you can do that, and as I say, I do it occasionally, but it won't make your stitches lie straight, and where your thread comes out of the fabric, it will, I can't explain it very well, but it does make a difference. But anyway, if you try it, you'll notice. You can get away with it for this, I'm just going to put that in through here now because I can't be bothered to unpick it. But you can get away with it for this type of Rhodes stitch because obviously you're going into every other hole. So it doesn't make too much of a difference on the back, although it does tug your stitch in a sort of different direction when it comes through the hole, when you don't follow the line of the stitches. But for a stitch, for example, a Rhodes stitch like this, where you're using every single hole, if you try and lessen the length of thread on the back and don't follow the pattern of the stitch as on the stitch diagram, you will find that your stitches will slip under the weave of the fabric. So it's always best to do the speciality stitches as the diagrams say, and try not to be tempted to lessen the thread use on the back, because you might be compromising the stitch on the front. But you know, have a little go and practice and you'll probably see what I mean rather than me rambling about it. Anyway, so that's that stitch. Bit clearer to see, you can see the fabric through the stitch, so you can see where each of the legs go in and come out of the fabric. Now there was one stitcher, although I've talked a bit about railroading, there's one stitcher who wanted to know how I railroad, so I just thought I'd show you how I do that very briefly, because obviously I know you all know how to cross stitch. But railroading, as I've said, just basically means putting your needle through the centre of the two threads of floss that you're using. So what I normally do, I do this for my bottom leg and my top leg, I just smooth it out and then go down into the fabric. If you've never railroaded before and it's something you start doing, you'll find it might slow you up a tiny bit, but actually once you get into the groove of it, I don't even notice now, I just do it automatically. So that's what I do. You'll find particularly railroading your threads it helps to keep your threads lying flat on the fabric, and it stops a stitch from twisting. So obviously it cuts down on wasting thread by twists and knots in it, but also especially if you're blending, if you're tweeding thread, so you're using two colours in the needle, obviously you want the thread to lie, each of those different coloured threads to lie side by side, nice and flat and parallel. So in that case, railroading is sort of essential. So that's how I railroad. I don't know how many stitches do railroad, a lot do. Maybe some of you don't. And you don't have to. It's just something I've got into the habit of when I'm stitching, so it's sort of second nature to me now to do that. So yeah, that's how I do my crosses, and hopefully makes them look a little bit neater and they lie nice and flat against the fabric. So that's that. Those are those 2 stitches. Now as I said, these 2 are sort of basic variations, basic shapes, sorry. So you've got a square and a rectangle, not the most exciting shapes ever seen. So what I've done is I've stitched up a few other examples to show you the different varieties of Rhodes stitch that you can get. And here they are. So at the top here, this is exactly the same stitch I've just shown, a square dense Rhodes stitch, but this time I've done it in a variegated thread, so you can see the effect that the variegation has. This one stitched in peacock feathers, my favourite Jodrey Designs hand dyed cotton. So it just shows how you can make the most of variegated thread really in some ways. This next one here I've stitched, not necessarily because I particularly like the colour, but because it's stitched in a number 12 pearl thread. So again, that's the same stitch, the same rectangular eyelet, Rhodes stitch. I'm not with it today. Just to show that perhaps when you use a thicker thread, it makes it a bit easier than trying to wrangle 2 strands of floss. You don't have to worry about laying it correctly because it's a single strand, and you don't have to worry about it twisting because it's a single strand, so it speeds things up a bit and gives another bit of texture. Just to show you the thread that I used for that one. That's here. It's a random number 12 pearl that I found in my stash. Over the weekend I was organising my threads a bit and I came across a whole bag of multicolour number 12 pearls that I'd forgotten I had. So I thought, oh well, just as well use that one to demonstrate that today. So that's that one. Now this one is another Rhodes variation. It's an octagonal Rhodes stitch. Again, it's stitched in peacock feathers. But it's just another variation you can do. Obviously you can see that it's stitched into every single hole, just like the dense Rhodes stitch, and it's just a case of varying the length of each leg of the stitch to create that shape. There's plenty of diagrams, stitch diagrams out there, so it's the same principle, you get the same twist, and you can see that also again the very last stitch, very last leg of each of those stitches lies in the same direction. So that's important. Same here. You can see a bit clearer with the variegated thread how the stitches, the top stitches lie in the same direction. This one here, these 2 are 2 of my favourite Rhodes variations. This one is a heart Rhodes stitch, and this one's obviously a butterfly Rhodes stitch. Now both of these I've stitched in a number 8 pearl-ish thread, Karen Water Lilies thread, and so it gives a nice, if I can sort of tilt the camera a bit, you get a nice bit of texture when you use that thread with these stitches. Again, exactly the same principle, you're just going round the stitch but just altering the length of the leg of the stitch each time to create that shape. So Rhodes stitches are brilliant really for not only geometric shapes like these, but also for creating irregular type shapes like these hearts and butterflies. So the 2 threads I used in this case, this one is terracotta, Karen Wildflowers. Did I say watercolours before? I can't remember. Anyway, I meant wildflowers thread in terracotta, and again wildflowers thread, but this time in chili for the hearts. So those were the 2 threads I used for those stitches. So when it comes to using speciality stitches, of course you can go out and you can find charts which have speciality stitches incorporated in them, but there's always room to personalise your work, whether it be in a chart you've bought or even in a kit. You know, these sort of hearts, any sort of loved themed chart where you think you might be able to personalise it a bit, you could use, you know, a rose heart stitch, or butterflies, you know, they're used in all sorts of different designs. Or maybe you're a stitcher who stitches cards a lot. Quite easy to incorporate these sort of themes, and also these sort of shapes. You could do a border. If your card needed a border, you could perhaps do a few Rhodes stitches in the border, mix it up with cross stitches. So there's all sorts of possibilities when it comes to using speciality stitches. You don't have to do millions of them. You can just do, you know, a few here and there to perhaps accent your work and to personalise it a bit more. So I'll try and find some stitch diagrams for you for these. I'll put them in the link below. Failing that, I'll just do some for you and put them in my Flickr account, which you could link to. I'll provide the link to, so you can have a look at them and have a little go on them for yourself. So there you are, that's the variations of rose stitches. Now, as I said at the beginning of this video, you can stitch these stitches on Aida. And to show solidarity with my Aida stitcher viewers, I stitched a few on Aida here. This is 14 count Aida. Obviously the top stitch there, straight away you can see, ideal for Aida, because we're only using every other hole, no need to split the weave of the fabric, so they are absolutely the same to stitch on Aida as they are on even weave. So for an Aida stitcher, that's an ideal Rhodes stitch to use. If you're happy splitting the weave of the fabric, then obviously you can do any stitch. I must say these Rhodes stitches aren't as neat as they could be. I couldn't find a sharp embroidery needle. I was using a tapestry needle to pierce the fabric, so they're not as even as they could be. But again, you know, those are the other dense Rhodes stitch that I demonstrated. You can stitch them on Aida, and you can even, if you want to, you know, do the other Rhodes variations, stitch a little butterfly or a heart. If you're happy piercing the weave of the fabric, then go for it. There's no stigma attached to stitching, well, as far as I'm concerned, to stitching specialty stitches on Aida. Absolutely perfectly fine and acceptable. So there you go, that is how I stitch, anyway, my Rhodes stitches and the other variations that you could try if you'd like. Okay, so that was my little tutorial about Rhodes stitches and how you can use them and how to stitch them. I hope it was helpful. It wasn't the easiest of videos to record, as you can probably imagine, but I tried. So if you've watched this video and you found it helpful, useful, please leave a comment. If people would like me, stitchers would like me to do more tutorials like that on different stitches, please let me know. Obviously if it's not helpful I won't do another one because they were quite stressful to film, but I don't mind doing it if it's something that people want to see, and if you think it would help you. I'm quite happy to do some more stitch tutorials, although you know, I wouldn't be able to do them, a lot of them, all the time, but I will endeavour to do some more if it proves to be helpful to any of you out there. If it encourages you to see somebody stitch a stitch like that, and if it will help you to do them, then I'm happy to film some more videos. So please leave a comment to let me know. So all that's left for me to say is I will be back at the end of the month with my normal stash and whip updates. I will probably do the September tag in my whip update, because it won't take me very long to give the answers to my questions, contrary to what you might think. So I will do that then. So what's left for me to say is thank you for watching and happy stitching.